Hey there, my name's Palmer. You're probably familiar with me if you've seen this channel before. If not, then this is my channel where I upload videos of my documenting my adventures. I don't usually do videos in this format, so this is kind of a new thing for me, so bear with this. But Kenzie and I, my wife and I, recently biked across the country. And we had all these questions, and it was kind of hard to find answers online, especially for our route. So I decided that what a great opportunity to kind of document some stats myself as we go. And each night, I would have this little notebook in here in the tent, and as we were winding down for the night, I'd write down some stats like distance, elevation gain, time, weather, keep a checkbook kind of all the money we spent on the trip. And then now I have documented this all on a spreadsheet. It actually took a really long time, and I think it could be really helpful to someone planning a trip across the country. So I'm going to go through about 9 different categories here. Feel free to skip around. I'll put chapters down in the description if you don't want to watch the whole thing. But I thought I'd start with when, where, and why. So getting started, we did the northern tier mostly. We started out actually west of where the northern tier starts. We didn't feel like Anacortes, Washington was the actual Pacific Ocean, so we started in La Push, which is, if you're familiar with Twilight, it's actually where all that takes place, far out on the Pacific Ocean in the Olympic Peninsula. Anyway, I could go into all the details, but we followed the northern tier once we got to Anacortes, and we took the northern tier across all the northern US states. And then once we got to Wisconsin, we hopped on the North Lakes route. So we left the northern tier and took the North Lakes route, crossed Lake Michigan via the Badger, SS Badger ferry. It was really fun, kind of expensive. And then we hopped on the Lake Erie connector, which took us across Michigan and then into Ontario, which made it kind of an international journey. And then we hopped back on the northern tier again. So we cut out Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. And then we left the northern tier again and hopped on the Empire State Trail just because we valued those rail trails so much. We took the Empire State Trail all the way to New York City, where we ended our trip. We started on June 4th in La Push, Washington, and we ended on August 23rd, 81 days later in New York City. So that was our coast to coast via mostly the northern tier. So I'm going to move on to some overall trip stats now. I kind of mentioned some of these, but in total it took us 81 days, and that includes 3 0 days. It was 3,969 miles, basically 4,000. On average, we pedaled 49 miles a day, or 51 if you exclude the 0 days. For every one of those miles, we averaged 31 feet per mile, which is kind of a great way, if you're not familiar, to gauge how hilly a route is. 31 is just pretty moderate, not too bad. Okay, so next section I'm going to move on to is finances. This is probably the one that gets asked about the most. How much does it cost to take 81 days to bike across the country? And there's some things I'm going to exclude from this because there's so many variables depending on how you're getting there. I'm going to exclude how we got to the push and how we got back from our ending point. I'm not going to include like health insurance while we were biking, or our car insurance we were paying for, or any other like just personal expenses like that weren't related to the bike trip. And lastly, I'm not going to include the gear that we had. As you might already have gear, you might need gear. And I actually made a gear video where I highlighted all the gear Kenzie and I took. And you can watch that if you want. But yeah, so with that said, these are our finances for the trip. In total, we spent $4,781. That is between the two of us. So if you divide that by 2 per person, it was $2,390 per person. However, there's a lot of expenses that we shared that if you were going out by yourself to do a bike trip across the country, you would have to pay more because anyway, you get it. So it's extremely important to mention here that this is highly variable, even though I cut out all the travel stuff. We met a lot of people who were like closer or in retirement, had a lot more money saved up. They could be a lot more frivolous with their spending. They'd stay in hotels a lot. We did not do that. We were on a tight budget. We were our goal was to stay under $1 per mile. We didn't quite get that, but we did pretty good, I think. And I think you definitely could do this for less, but it would be difficult, especially if you're not following the Trans-America route, because the Trans-America route has a lot more resources for cyclists. Northern tier is a little more scant in the resources, lots more paid campgrounds, stuff like that. So next I'm going to break that spending into categories. First off, gas stations and general stores, we spent about $586 at, but I suspect it's more than that. I just don't think my bank account categorized it quite accurately. A lot of that was probably shared with grocery and dollar stores. But yeah, gas stations are an expensive place to get groceries or food for the trip if you're on a budget, but you have to do it sometimes. So our second category, grocery stores and dollar stores, was $1,735. We would always try to get to a grocery store if we could, rather than a gas station. I felt bad about it because it wasn't supporting the local businesses, but it's also sometimes their only option is like a Dollar General or a Dollar Tree, and you can get really cheap groceries here. It saved us a ton of money to buy groceries there than local places. As much as I felt bad about that, it just wasn't something we could afford. So next up is restaurants and coffee shops. We spent $684 at restaurants and coffee shops. I think that's a little inflated too. I don't think we quite spent that much because we only ate out a handful of times. But we would go to coffee shops a lot to get Wi-Fi so I could upload the videos, and we'd buy something there to be courteous and all. And we did eat out probably once per state, maybe a little more, just as a reward, especially if you can find a buffet. It's usually going to get your money's worth when you're bicycle touring. Next up, we spent about $810 on hotels. You definitely could spend way more on hotels. We found each hotel we stayed at for, it had to be under 100 or just barely over. We wouldn't do anything super fancy. And we tried to keep it down to one hotel per state. So if you do the math, it's about 800. But yeah, so that's not bad. If you do one hotel per state and you're on a budget with those hotels, really getting the best deal, you could expect to spend about that much. And then campgrounds, this one is highly variable. Even on if you did the same route I did, or we did, we spent $354 at campgrounds. You could definitely spend a lot more at these campgrounds for reasons I won't get into. But we were on a tight budget, like I mentioned, and a lot of these campgrounds were run down. There was no one else there. So we would get there late, leave early in the morning. Usually they're around $20. In Washington State, they had hiker-biker sites, which were amazing. You could spend like $5 per campsite just for a hiker-biker site, and you get to hang out with a bunch of other cyclists. It was really a treat to have in the early stages, especially when we were a little slower, so we were camping more often in that state. To have that like $5 campsite was amazing, and it really saved us a ton of money. Okay, so I had a lot of fun breaking this down by state, our expenses, because it is highly variable by state or country in the case of Ontario. And so the way I quantified this was in dollars per mile versus state. So the dollars per mile for every mile we rode, how much did we spend? That was kind of the best way to get a baseline. And something to keep in mind is how far we were riding per day had a significant effect on our dollars per mile. Because if we were able to ride 60 miles, then we're camping less, whereas when we started, we were only riding like 30 miles a day. We were pretty slow. It was rough terrain. The resources were more expensive because of how spread out they were, things like that. So there's a lot of variables here. So in Washington State, we spent about $1.67 per mile. That was our most expensive state per mile, largely because of how slow we were going. Like I said, thankfully they had those hiker-biker sites, or else it would have been way more expensive. Idaho was our cheapest state, but it's such a small sample size that I wouldn't really put much thought into it. We just happened to get Warmshowers and Stealth Camp one night, and we had a lot of groceries going into it. We were coming off a 0 day in Washington, so we didn't spend much. It's Montana. We were starting to get our speed, and especially in the plains. Well, in western Montana, it was pretty expensive because campgrounds and all were like private campsites we had to stay at. You go through Kalispell, you go through Glacier National Park. It's really cool, it's beautiful, but it's kind of expensive. Eastern Montana and the plains, you're actually camping in a lot of small towns, and there's city parks, and it's usually free. So it would actually drop the price there. And we were also starting to go a lot faster by the time we got to the plains. So our price dropped down to about $1.28 per mile. And then North Dakota was similar to Montana, except it's just more of the plains. We crossed it in like 7 or 8 days, and we spent 97 cents per mile. This is our first larger state where we actually were under budget and not over budget. Minnesota was almost all rail trails and all, and so we were able to be pretty efficient again. Lots of flatter terrain, and we spent $1.01 per mile. Campgrounds were probably one of our larger expenses there. In Wisconsin, it was kind of similar to Minnesota, a little more hilly, a little more rugged, a little more remote, so it ended up being higher, I would say, $1.12 per mile. In Michigan, we had our bicycles started to have some maintenance needs that we couldn't address on the road, so we took them to a bike shop, got new chains, new stuff, and so that added a lot. We needed shifting adjustments. That added a lot to Michigan's dollars per mile since we were only in Michigan for a few days. But we spent $1.33 per mile. And then Ontario was actually one of the cheapest, I guess it was a province, but cheapest states you know what I'm saying, to ride in. The groceries were a lot less. I was surprised. The campgrounds were about the same price, but they're really nice campgrounds. And so we got a little frivolous since we were only there 3 days, and we spent a little more money, but I would say if you're looking at riding into Canada, you can expect to spend less. And then New York, we spent 85 cents per mile, which is, I would say, our best. And that was largely because we were on the Empire State Trail the whole time. There's a lot of resources for cyclists. If there's a lot of cycling resources, you're gonna spend less. And then it was also flat, so we were able to go further each day. And we were just dialed in by the end of the trip. We had our legs under us, and we knew what to expect. We knew how to save money, and we even got an expensive hotel in New York, but we still managed to stay at 85 cents per mile. So moving on, I'm gonna address the weather throughout the trip. This is gonna be highly variable depending on where you're cycling, but if you're doing a northern route or something similar, or really even the Trans-America, you can probably expect to experience something of the same. So to start off, I'll say we had 25 days with rain. 15 of those 25 were while we were riding. So if we like put on a rain jacket, I marked that down for we had rain while riding that day. But we had a lot of rain overnight while we were camping, or maybe it rained and we weren't cycling. We managed to get to a library or something. So 25 days with rain. I think it was an extra rainy year. People were saying in like Montana that it was the rainiest and greenest season they'd seen in a long time. So we definitely got a lot more rain, especially in Minnesota and Wisconsin. We got hit by some pretty strong, severe weather. But yeah, 15 days while riding. I saw another guy had like 11 days with rain while riding. So you can expect some rain definitely in the summer in the Midwest. And so another aspect of the weather I actually documented via my Garmin is the temperatures we experienced. And this is actually surface temperature as opposed to the ambient temperature, I guess. You have to take it with a grain of salt because it's a surface temperature. So it's probably around 10, maybe even 15 degrees depending on, at least for the high temperature. But low temperature is going to be very accurate, I would say, because it's not as affected by the sunlight. And then the average is probably going to be like 5 degrees warmer than it actually was. With that said, eastern Montana was our hottest area by far. Glendive, Jordan, these small towns. I mean, there's no trees out there. And we got hit by a heat wave really bad, and we actually had to start riding at night to avoid these crazy, it was like ambient 100 degrees in the heat of the day, no shade, really dangerous. And then we started to get trees again eventually, which was really great. You take trees for granted so much. Our warmest day was actually as we were leaving Montana and entering North Dakota. We had stayed in a hotel that night. We're waiting out the heat wave when we left at the tail end of the day. Still so hot that we had an average temperature of 91 degrees with a high of 118 surface temperature. But it was, I think the ambient that day was like 106 degrees. It was terribly hot. You wouldn't think it would get that hot so far north. And then our coldest day, on the other hand, on average, was actually our first full day of cycling, June 5th. And it was on the Olympic Peninsula. It must have just been cloudy, I can't remember. But we had an average temperature that day at 54 degrees, so really not that cold. The coldest temperature my Garmin recorded was on the east side of the Cascades in Washington, in the coulee country, as they say, and it was 37 degrees. I don't think when we were camping it ever got below freezing. It was pretty moderate on the low end for the temperatures. With that said, I've got a couple cool graphs I made to highlight this data. There's a little bit that can be taken away from it. Once again, Idaho, it looks like it was the hottest on here, but it was only 2 days. You can get a general trend by looking at this one. And then there's another graph where I just plotted the temperatures in a line graph. It's kind of interesting. Take it as you will. So each day in my journal, I would document if we had a tailwind or a headwind, and then I would rank it on a -3 to +3 scale. So a +3 would be an extreme tailwind, and a -3 would be an extreme headwind. We ended up having 30 tailwind days and 33 headwind days, but our wind effect was positive 0.33 overall. So basically what that means is though we had more headwind days, when we had a headwind, it was not as effective as the tailwinds were when we had them, which is overly analytical, but I've heard of people having much better luck with tailwinds than we did. And then there's, of course, you're going to notice a headwind a lot more than you will a tailwind. It's a lot harder to notice a tailwind because you're going to hear a headwind, you're going to feel it, it's going to slow you down. You might not notice when a tailwind is speeding you up. We met in Montana some westbound travelers as opposed to us going to eastbound, and they were really upset at the wind. They'd been having a hard time just because if you're heading in the direction of the prevailing winds, when you do have a headwind, it's typically not going to be as large. Whereas if you're fighting the prevailing winds, and there's much more likely that there's going to be an extremely strong direction of wind travel in the prevailing wind direction as opposed to opposing the prevailing winds, especially in the Midwest. This chart here didn't turn out to be as telling as I thought it would, but the red line here is really what matters, and that is the trend line basically for the tailwind headwind. You can see starting out we had some tailwind days. It was really light wind in the Pacific Northwest, and then when we got to eastern Montana, we had a lot of strong tailwinds that really pushed us. And the only section where the headwinds were really slowing us down was actually in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. We had a lot of headwind days, but lower headwind days. And then as we continued on, the prevailing winds caught up with us and we had some more tailwind days. All right, so our next category I have down here is wildlife and insects. Starting off the insects by state. So at the end of each day, I'd rank on a 1 to 5 scale how bad we perceived the insects to be that day. So with 5 being borderline miserable, or maybe even miserable at camp usually. Usually they weren't a big problem on the bike unless it was the biting flies of some sort. And 1 being we had no insect problems at all. So if you look at this chart here I made, I kind of averaged it all out. Washington, we had basically no insect issues. Idaho, none, which makes sense when you think about it. And then in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan were the 3 worst states by far for insects. Minnesota, I mean, they say the mosquitoes are the state bird there. It's no, so we totally expected insects to be terrible, but we also had a big problem in Minnesota with deer flies. They weren't as widespread. Deer flies weren't as widespread as mosquitoes. There were days in Minnesota and Wisconsin, especially when we were around a lake, where the mosquitoes would be so bad we'd just hide in the tent with the bug net. You step out of the tent and you're getting swarmed. You get into the tent, especially in Michigan actually, which we didn't expect. We thought Michigan would be kind of moving away from bugs, but some of our worst mosquitoes were in Michigan. It'd be just these little tiny mosquitoes everywhere, and we'd have to quickly unzip the tent, get in, zip it up, kill any mosquitoes that got in. And it was at crazy high density, usually at evening, and I think it was usually at evening, maybe early in the morning, I can't remember. Some other notable wildlife that you might have questions about, as far as bears are probably one of the biggest concerns on the northern tier, that especially grizzlies. We found that all the campgrounds, almost all of them that we stayed in, grizzly country or black bear country, had bear boxes at each campsite or in a cluster of campsites, so you could just store your food in that bear box of peace of mind and not deal with it. The only time we had a bear encounter was in Ontario, actually. We did carry bear spray though, up until we got out of the Rocky Mountains. So when we crossed into the plains, we sent our bear spray home. We didn't feel like we needed it. Honestly, the bear spray was probably better for peace of mind when we were camping in areas where we were more concerned about human activity. Snakes are the other big wildlife issue we had, and probably the most dangerous one, because in eastern Montana they have a lot of prairie rattlesnakes. They're not really a problem during the day, we found, but during that heat wave when we had to ride at night to avoid the heat, the sun would set, the snakes would come out onto those roads that we were riding on to warm up, because there was still some residual heat coming out of the road from the hot day. So they love that. They sit out on that road. You can't really see them at night. They kind of look like sticks or something. And then all of a sudden we were biking and there was rattling going off around us. We not know we were passing by a rattlesnake, but we hear the rattle and it would freak us out. But they were the most scary in a traditional sense animal that we dealt with. Next subject I'm going to touch on is performance metrics. I think this is one of the most fascinating subjects of the whole trip. Starting off, I'm going to cover our miles per hour. I summed this up on this chart by state. The thing about miles per hour is it doesn't show a great picture. 10 miles an hour is about the speed you're going to travel if you're chilling and you're just a normal person while you're touring and you have a normal heavy loadout. 10 miles an hour is just kind of what ends up happening. I mean, headwind, tailwind, we were always kind of around 10 miles an hour. The only thing that would change with a headwind per se would be we would be working harder for that 10 miles an hour. Not really thinking about it, but we would feel more sore at the end of the day. Whereas with a tailwind, it would almost be like a rest day, but we'd still end up averaging around 10 miles an hour. It's the weird thing. We did technically in Washington and Idaho and western Montana, as you can see on here, have slightly slower averages, 9 miles an hour, 9.5 in western Montana, as we got our cycling legs under us. That was mostly due to the terrain and us just starting out. So it doesn't say a lot. What does say a lot is our hours in the saddle. So I think this is much more telling of how our body was adapting to the day-to-day routine of biking all day. So this next chart has a much more kind of linear progression. In Washington State, we averaged 3 hours, 40 minutes per day in the saddle, which isn't a lot, but when you think about like a 3 hour and 40-minute bike ride every day, this is including 0 days too. I mean, that's a significant bike ride 7 days a week. And it hurt our bodies. I mean, we were having knee pain, we were having lots of issues in Washington State that didn't really resolve until we got into Idaho. They say the first 2 weeks is going to be the hardest of any tour, and it really did prove to be the case. Once we got over that 2-week hump, our bodies felt great, and we didn't really have any joint pain anymore, maybe a little thing here or there. Western Montana, I divided Western and Eastern Montana because it's vastly different terrain. So Western Montana, we averaged 4.5 hours. That's about an hour more than Washington State per day. And then Eastern Montana, the terrain was still hilly mostly, but it definitely was tamed down, and we're just getting stronger and stronger, and our bodies can withstand more time in the saddle every day, which is really what makes a difference on how many miles you can do. So 4 hours, 55 minutes, almost 5 hours basically in Eastern Montana per day. And I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to think like you're breaking camp, and you're setting up camp at the end of the day, and you want to have some downtime at the end of the day. You need time to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then you're gonna stop. Like in Eastern Montana, we spent the middle of the day in the libraries usually, or in small towns, just cooling down, waiting for the heat to pass. So there's a lot of things you're doing that aren't bicycling that you wouldn't think about. It's not like you're riding 12 hours a day or more in the summer. You're really gonna wear yourself out fast. We chose to be a little steadier. North Dakota was some of our easiest terrain, in Minnesota, so we actually averaged about 5 hours, 20 minutes per day in the saddle. In Wisconsin, this is when we were really just starting to feel good, and everything after Wisconsin was really smooth sailing. 5.5 hours. Michigan, 5 hours, 20 minutes, just variables in there. And then Ontario, we were able to average 6.5 hours, which was our greatest average for the section. Smaller sample size again. In New York, we averaged 6 hours a day. So, 6 times 42 hours a week, basically, full-time job. Okay, this next chart's very similar. It's just our distance per day by state. So in Washington, we averaged 30 miles per day. And by the end, in New York, we were averaging about a little over 60 miles per day. And so you can see it's a steady increase in our mileage per day. And that was more of a result of riding for more hours of the day as we went on, getting better at bicycle touring as we went on. And overall, like I said earlier, our average distance per day, including the 0 days, was 49 miles per day, or 51 if you exclude the zeros. So if I were planning another bicycle touring trip, which I am, I would plan for about 50 miles per day. Okay, moving on now to elevation, or how much elevation gain you can expect. This is a big question we had. We wanted to know, like, were we training in adequate terrain? Basically, how mountainous would it be? So the way I quantified this was our elevation gain, so how much we went up per mile, and then I subdivided that into different states, like the other graphs. Starting off with Washington, this was one of our hilliest states, as you can see. I mean, it's like endless mountain ranges in Washington, especially in the northern part. And we actually dodged some of them. If you stay on the northern tier route through Washington, you'll actually go through more mountains than we did, and this number will be a lot higher. But we dipped down in the Columbia Plateau and then came back up into Spokane. So 46 feet of gain per mile. That's nothing to look away from. Idaho, 27 feet per mile. We were just in floodplains the whole time. And then Western Montana, obviously divided these. Western Montana was about 50 feet per mile, which is technically our hilliest section. Rocky Mountains here. Then Eastern Montana was still hilly, but it was definitely nowhere near the mountains, 30 feet per mile. Then it was slowly descending and getting flatter and flatter. Minnesota, Michigan, and Ontario were definitely our flattest states. Not to say they didn't have hills. Wisconsin was surprisingly hilly. Those Northwoods have a lot of glacial hills, like the glaciers push down in areas or carved out areas, and you go up and down that terrain. So our flattest state, Ontario, was only 16 feet of gain per mile, which is very flat. Hence why we averaged like 70 miles a day in Ontario. With that said, our hilliest day overall was climbing Washington Pass over the Cascades. We had 117 feet of gain one day per mile. Granted, we did a very short day that day. The day after, we did about 50 miles with 100 feet of gain per mile. So it can be really hilly. So it varies a lot. Right, next up, next category I'm gonna do is road and traffic conditions, which is our traffic per state, similar to the insects. I ranked this on a 1 to 5 scale each day. But states that had, like Minnesota was mostly the Paul Bunyan Trail. So it was our lowest traffic rating. It was really good. We were hardly ever interacting with cars. New York was similar, except for just one day, really. Ontario generally was pretty low traffic. We had some rail trail. Western Montana was pretty scary. A lot of those mountain roads are no shoulders. As far as tire choice goes, I definitely wouldn't want a road bike tire. The rail trails, especially if they're muddy, can be pretty sloshy, and that is not ideal. And then with a wider tire, like 38 millimeters, I wouldn't really want to go anything below 35. I had 42 millimeters. 42, 38, they really absorb. You can run them at a slightly lower pressure, but still be efficient on them, especially if it's thinner slick in it. And it really dampens a lot. It's better for your wheel as it dampens that. It's better for your comfort, better for your hands. If you're riding on road bike tires, you have to keep them at a really high pressure, and it's harder on your spokes, harder on everything when you're carrying a huge load. We really liked our wider tires, and like the Empire State Trail at times, even along the northern tier, was pretty rough. Like, I mean, there's significantly sized rocks. And then when we got into muddy areas on those rail trails, you'd be at a huge disadvantage running a road bike tire. Okay, next up, I'm going to cover our sleeping arrangements every night. Just jumping right into that, we had 34 times where we stayed at a campsite that had a fee to stay there. Those fees were probably most commonly around $20 if you were to average it. And then with that said, we had actually 11 free campsites, which what I mean is that it was explicitly stated that this campsite was free to stay at. A lot of those were city parks in like Montana, North Dakota. And then lastly, we had 12 stealth camps. We weren't camping at a campground, basically. We were camping in a park that did not allow camping technically, or in the woods off the road. Something you just have to do sometimes, even though it's not ideal. It does save a lot of money. I don't think we were ever bothered while we were stealth camping, actually. All in all, we camped 57 times, if you add all that up, which is 81 days. We had 6 times where we stayed at a warm shower, 6 times where we stayed at family or friends. We got 10 hotels or Airbnbs. 1 per state was our goal. And then we had 2 biker hostels. Shout out to the Honey Hub and the Bicycle Bunkhouse. If you're doing the Trans-America route, you're going to have way more of these biker hostels. Northern Tier doesn't have as many because it's not as traveled. Oh, it's also worth mentioning that many of those warm showers we camped at, we didn't actually sleep in the house. It was just, we were more comfortable in our tent by that point. That's about all the stats I have. Conclusion, please leave any questions in the comments. I'm actually not very good, unfortunately, at responding to comments, but I will try on this video to do better at that and answer any questions you may have. I'm